A flight attendant struck a black CEO's baby with a tray, but what he did next turned that tray into a tool of instant justice. A flight attendant hit the black CEO's baby with a tray, thinking no one would challenge him. He didn't realize the father would turn that very tray into the instrument to fire every single one of them. The moment metal struck, the cabin's power dynamics flipped. Subscribe. If you believe arrogance collapses the instant true authority rises. The tray tilted forward just as Darian Cross reached to steady his son's pacifier. It had rolled slightly from the edge of the cabin crib, nudged by the subtle tremble of the aircraft's climb. Darian's right hand moved instinctively, fingers brushing the soft plastic bulb, eyes still half on the crib's straps. He barely registered the movement to his left, a flicker of motion, a shift in air pressure before a sharp clang rang out inches from his ear. A metal tray cart clattered against the side wall, too close. Much too close. He jerked upright, one hand now pressed protectively across his infant son, Kelrin's chest. The baby stirred, letting out a brief whimper, but didn't fully wake. The cabin, though still humming with the smooth mechanical rhythm of ascent, suddenly felt off. Not broken, not loud, just off. Darian's eyes scanned the aisle. The man responsible stood a few feet away, already moving, brisk, rigid, almost theatrical in his avoidance of eye contact. Renard Vale. The flight attendant who had offered no welcome, no acknowledgement, not even a nod when Darian boarded. His expression now held no apology, only the faintest twitch of annoyance as if the near collision was Darian's fault for existing too close to his path. The gesture had been subtle, but not accidental. That tray cart hadn't drifted. It had been placed, angled slightly toward Darian's seat in a way no experienced attendant would allow during climb. Darian didn't speak. Not yet. He adjusted Kelrin's blanket and leaned back, breathing deeply through his nose. The other passengers in first class remained undisturbed, immersed in screens or flipping through menus. But Darian's awareness heightened, sharpened like a lens narrowing in on one detail at a time. He studied Renard's retreating form. The man's steps were clipped, posture rigid. His jaw clenched as he muttered under his breath, passing row 2. His eyes flicked over Darian's seat again, fast, cold, then away. Something more than disinterest was pulsing through this man. There was resentment. From behind the curtain that separated the galley, a muffled voice drifted out. Another male, softer, arguing in half-whispers. "You said not to bring it up now. He's already watching." The voice faded before Darian could catch more. A different flight attendant soon emerged, Taryn Vess. Lighter frame, younger, his demeanor lacked the stiffness of his colleague. He moved with an effortful calm, like someone walking a tightrope between obedience and fear. When he noticed Darian watching, Taryn offered a thin smile. It was polite, almost apologetic. Then, just as quickly, he looked away. So that's 2 of them, Darian thought. One nervous, one simmering. Kelrin's pacifier slipped again, rolling softly along the edge of the crib's internal cushion. Darian reached again, slower this time, hyper-aware. He didn't like feeling suspicious, but instinct, refined over years in boardrooms and negotiation halls, was whispering now. It was the same feeling that told him when a deal had hidden terms, when a smiling partner was sharpening knives beneath the table. He glanced to his left. A second tray cart, larger this time, was positioned almost diagonally near the aisle wall. Its edge hovered just near Darian's armrest. Too close again. He looked at it for several seconds. No motion. No turbulence. The cart just waited. Taryn appeared from the other side of the curtain, paused and looked directly at it, then quickly back to Darian. His throat bobbed. Something in him wanted to say more. "Is that okay there?" Darian asked mildly, nodding toward the cart. Taryn hesitated. I'll adjust it, sir." He pulled the cart gently to the side, clearly aware it never should have been left so near a passenger. His hands moved nervously, the motions practiced but trembled slightly. From the galley, Renard's voice floated out again, this time louder, edgier. If he wanted peace and quiet, maybe he should have booked a private flight, not cluttered first class with a crib. The words weren't shouted, but they weren't hidden either. Taryn froze mid-motion. Darian's gaze hardened. The phrase hung in the air like smoke, spoken to no one, yet meant for him. He leaned back in his seat, holding Kelrin closer. The baby stirred again, lip quivering. Darian hummed a soft note, the one that always soothed Kelrin at home. But his eyes never left the galley. "Your colleague seems stressed," Darian said evenly to Taryn as he passed again. Taryn nodded once, lips tight. "I'm sorry, sir. Just give me a moment to sort the trays." But the sorting never finished. The cabin lights dimmed, standard procedure for altitude transition. But to Darian, the sudden darkness wrapped the space like a pressure lid. The windows reflected soft halos of cloud and sky. But inside, tension had pooled like oil. Darian shifted his body slightly, just enough to watch Renard return again, this time with a metal tray in hand. Balanced flat, arms stiff. His eyes scanned the cabin but locked for a brief second on Darian and Kelrin. They narrowed. Something flared behind them. Kelrin let out a soft coo. Renard's pace slowed as he neared. Darian saw it, just a flicker in Renard's movement. Not a stumble. A choice. His foot twisted slightly inward, his grip on the tray tightening as if bracing for impact. No turbulence present. Just proximity. And tension. A whisper returned to Darian's ears. This time from a passenger in row 3, a male voice to his right. "Something's wrong with that guy. Saw him snap at a mother on a flight last month. Crew said nothing." Darian didn't move. He placed a hand calmly over the edge of Kelrin's crib. The tray's metallic edge glinted faintly as Renard passed too close again. Not touching, not striking, but just close enough to be felt. The humming engines outside masked the quiet conflict inside. And still, Darian said nothing. Because something inside him already knew this wasn't a mistake waiting to happen. It was a decision. And soon it would collide with consequences. The storm that would consume the flight had just begun to form. The tray struck the crib with a dull metallic crack. Kelrin's cry pierced the cabin instantly, raw and sharp, louder than the engine's steady hum. The infant's small body jolted from the unexpected impact, his tiny fists flailing as his eyes squeezed shut in startled pain. Darian Cross's breath caught in his throat. For a single second, the entire world shrank to the red mark blooming on his child's temple and the stunned silence that followed. Passengers nearby froze. One man gasped audibly. A woman 3 rows down raised her hand to her mouth, but no one moved. No one stood. Renard Vale stood over the crib, a steel tray still quivering in his grip, his jaw locked tight. "Turbulence," he said flatly, offering the word like a shield. "Wasn't intentional." His voice carried no apology, no concern, just a forced justification. Darian didn't speak right away. His arms moved first, instinctively, protectively, as he lifted Kelrin from the crib and pressed the infant against his chest, murmuring softly into his son's ear to soothe the sobs. The warmth of the child's breath touched his collarbone, a painful reminder of how fragile this moment had become. "You hit him," Darian said quietly, each word carved with controlled disbelief. "You hit my son." Renard shook his head with mechanical disinterest. "I didn't hit him. I was walking past, the plane jolted, the tray slipped." But Darian saw through the lie. He had seen the glare in Renard's eyes earlier, the tight grip on the tray, the deliberate veer in his path toward the crib. This wasn't turbulence, it was tension, disguised, bottled, then finally released. A few seats away, flight attendant Taryn Vess rushed forward, eyes wide, face pale. He knelt beside Darian without hesitation, concern etched in every line of his expression. "Is the baby hurt?" he whispered. Darian nodded slowly. "He's frightened. The tray grazed him. His head." Taryn glanced at the red mark and sucked in a breath. "That's not minor." Renard scoffed. "It was an accident, Taryn. Don't make this something it's not." Taryn didn't respond. Instead, he leaned in toward Darian, lowering his voice to a whisper. "He's been like this for weeks. Angry. Pushing limits. I filed reports. No one listened." The words settled like iron on Darian's spine. Reports. Warnings. Dismissed. Darian looked around the cabin. Some passengers had turned away, pretending to read or sleep. Others stared cautiously, caught between curiosity and fear. A man in a suit slowly raised his phone as if to adjust settings, but the camera lens was pointed squarely in Renard's direction. Darian's anger swelled, but it didn't burst. It condensed, focused. With calm, deliberate motion, he reached toward the seat beside him and picked up the tray Renard had dropped. It still bore a faint dent from the impact, still trembled faintly from the force it had carried. Darian set it gently on his lap. "I'll hold on to this," he said softly, more to himself than to anyone else. His voice wasn't loud, but it carried through the rows like a quiet signal. Renard narrowed his eyes. "You don't need to make a scene." "This isn't a scene," Darian replied, never looking up. "It's a record." Taryn took a step back. The air around them shifted. Something in the cabin changed, like the pressure before a storm. The hum of the engines now seemed to underscore a deeper rhythm, the sound of passengers beginning to understand that something had happened which couldn't be ignored. Phones tilted subtly. Eyeglasses caught reflections. People were paying attention. Taryn hesitated before stepping closer again. "I don't think he's going to admit it. Not unless—" "I'm not waiting for his admission," Darian interrupted. "I want accountability." Taryn nodded once, then stood tall, his posture subtly aligning with Darian's. No longer just a flight attendant, now a witness. Renard looked down at the tray in Darian's lap, and for the first time, a flicker of uncertainty danced behind his cold gaze. "Give that to me," he said, extending his hand. Darian didn't flinch. "No." A silence followed, heavy, contained. Darian looked at his son again, who had quieted now, nestled into the safe curve of his father's chest. His breaths were shallow, interrupted by the occasional hiccup of a cry. Darian brushed a hand over the infant's back, grounding himself, then turned his focus to the tray once more. He could feel it, the shift. This wasn't about just one moment of cruelty. It was a test, of power, of silence, of what happens when injustice meets restraint. "The captain needs to know," Darian said to Taryn. "He won't listen to me," Taryn replied. "They've been screening our communications. We're not supposed to escalate unless it goes through the supervisor first." "Who's the supervisor?" Renard's silence answered that. Darian's jaw tightened. "Then I'll speak to the captain myself," he said. "You can't just walk to the cockpit," Renard snapped. "Sit down. You're not allowed up there mid-flight." Darian met his eyes calmly. "Then get out of my way." But Renard didn't move. A low murmur rose from the nearby rows. Uneasy, curious. The tension was now public. What had begun as a quiet ripple was turning into a wave. Every second that passed made it harder for Arisline to pretend this moment didn't exist. Still holding his son, still seated, Darian stared ahead, unmoving. He didn't shout. He didn't threaten. He waited. And with the tray resting across his lap, cold, dented, undeniable, he sent a message no one in the cabin could miss. The tray had moved from a weapon of harm to a symbol of power in Darian's hands. Renard Vale lunged forward without warning, his hand snapping toward the tray resting on Darian Cross's lap. The motion wasn't violent, but it was invasive, possessive. a clear attempt to reclaim control of the narrative. Darian didn't flinch. He held the tray firmly with one hand, his other arm still wrapped protectively around Kaelrin, whose soft cries had quieted into the occasional whimper. The baby's cheek still bore a faint red mark where the metal had grazed him earlier. Darian's expression was calm, but his eyes were locked in, steel-focused. He didn't raise his voice. "I'd like to speak with the captain," he said clearly, addressing not just Renard but the entire cabin around him. The flight attendant's response was immediate and rigid. He stepped directly in front of Darian, planting himself in the aisle like a wall. His eyes were sharp, but not from authority, more from panic disguised as defiance. "That won't be necessary," Renard said flatly. "The turbulence already caused one misunderstanding. No need to elevate things further." Darian blinked slowly, assessing him. "You mean the strike on my infant's head?" Taran Vess, who had been standing slightly behind, took a cautious step forward. He looked from Darian to Renard, torn. His voice came out low, like it wasn't meant to be heard by everyone. "Sir, we're not allowed to report anything to the captain unless it goes through the flight supervisor first." Darian turned his head slowly. "Excuse me?" "It's a policy," Taran added quickly, his voice tightening. "We were briefed before boarding. No incident reports get to the cockpit without supervisor review. Something about minimizing passenger panic." But Darian heard the lie behind the excuse. That wasn't about panic. That was about control. His mind flicked into business mode. The calm, strategic executive he had trained himself to be for years began to map the situation like a boardroom betrayal. Layers were stacking. A violent moment, an obstructive response, an institutional barrier to reporting. And now, a crew member, visibly frightened, admitting there was an internal filter on communication with the flight's command. Renard noticed the change in Darian's expression and tried again, reaching subtly toward the tray. "You don't need to hold on to that." Darian's grip tightened. He didn't move, but the message was clear. This wasn't going to be brushed aside. Passengers around them had stopped pretending not to notice. A few craned their necks subtly. One man in a tailored gray suit leaned toward another and whispered just loud enough. "That guy, Renard. I've seen him before. Something like this happened last year. A kid in coach. Whole thing disappeared." Darian heard it. The words sank into his bones like a slow poison. Not an isolated act. Not a moment of bad judgment. A pattern. The plane rocked gently with another bump of turbulence, just enough to mask the tension in voices that began to rise. But even the vibrations in the fuselage couldn't conceal the truth forming mid-air. Darian lowered his voice. "Why is this being hidden? Why does your team need approval to notify the captain that a child has been struck?" Renard's jaw flexed. "Sir, I'm asking you to stay seated and let us handle this internally." "No," Darian said, his tone firm but calm. "You don't get to handle this internally. Not when internal means silent." Taran swallowed hard. He stepped closer again, as if the weight of his conscience was starting to exceed the weight of his fear. He leaned in, voice barely audible. "He's on what we call a protective roster," he whispered. "Internal tier clearance. It shields certain crew members from suspension unless flagged directly by command." Darian's eyes narrowed. "Why?" Taran didn't answer. He just looked away, ashamed. The implications were horrifying. The airline had categories, shields. Protocols meant not to protect passengers, but to protect those who harmed them. And those categories had clearly been activated now. Renard took a step closer, visibly sweating. "You're escalating something that doesn't need escalation. These things can be misinterpreted." "The only thing misinterpreted," Darian cut in, "is your role. You think you're here to control the story, but you've already lost control of the truth." He reached up and pressed the overhead call button. The ding pierced the cabin. It was small, quiet, but it sounded like a declaration of war. The silence afterward was louder than any alarm. Heads turned, eyes widened. Even the engine seemed to hum a little softer in anticipation. Darian didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. Every movement was intentional. Every breath calculated. His hand still rested on the tray, metal, dented, gleaming in the dim overhead lights. But now it wasn't just an object. It was a witness. A child had been hurt. A man had tried to cover it. A system had enabled it. And now a father had chosen not to sit quietly. The flight was no longer just traveling between cities. It was slicing through layers of silence built over time by policies meant to keep people compliant. Renard opened his mouth to object again, but something in Darian's gaze made him stop. The captain hadn't yet emerged, but the battleground had formed. Terran stood in place, breathing heavily, the panic in his eyes slowly shifting toward resolve. Darian stared forward, the tray on his lap and his son safely against his chest, as the light above his seat blinked quietly. The cabin had turned into a quiet battlefield where silence had been protecting the wrong man. "Get the captain," Darian said, his voice low, steady, but undeniable in its command. Passengers around him stopped whispering. The calm in his voice contrasted so sharply with the storm behind his eyes that it drew attention more effectively than any shout could. Kelrin stirred in his arms, the soft baby blanket damp with a single tear trailing down the infant's cheek. The tray, still warm from his lap, had been set aside for a moment, but its weight lingered in the cabin air. "I said, get the captain," Darian repeated. Renard Vale stepped in front of him again, taller now in posture than before, like a soldier defending a gate. His arm extended, palm up as if Darian were about to trespass on something sacred. "That won't be necessary, sir. The turbulence explains everything. We've got protocol for these things," Renard said, almost lazily. His eyes were dismissive, the kind that had long stopped seeing people and only saw problems. Terran Vess's silhouette reappeared beside them, but this time he didn't look hesitant. He planted his feet between the two men, breaking the visual line Renard had tried to draw across the aisle like a barricade. His eyes met Darian's and held. "The captain, Laren Cade," Terran said under his breath, voice tight. "He's not like the others. He's firm, but he's fair. If he knows what happened, he won't let it be buried." Darian studied him, reading the flicker of truth beneath the uniform. Then something in Terran's posture shifted. He leaned slightly forward and added something that made Darian's stomach drop. "But I think Cade might already be compromised. There's a deal, something the crew supervisors arranged." Renard gave a faint chuckle behind them. "You really think the captain's in charge up there?" he muttered, not loud but enough to be heard. "He gets his orders like the rest of us." Darian narrowed his eyes. What kind of orders silence a child's injury? The question wasn't rhetorical. It was surgical. Renard didn't answer. Instead, his earpiece buzzed with a soft, static tremor. The timing was too perfect. Darian watched as Renard instinctively reached to his hip, tapped the device, and then subtly turned it off. No message read, no response given. Just a cold silence where something important was meant to live. Terran flinched slightly as if seeing a ghost crawl back into the closet. "We're not supposed to escalate situations involving—" He hesitated, then exhaled sharply. "Involving first-class males traveling with infants." Darian's brows furrowed. The words didn't make sense until they did. That wasn't a phrase born of logistics. It was classification, filtering, discrimination dressed in policy language, a hidden rule buried in an operations manual no passenger was ever meant to see. The plane vibrated faintly beneath them, a mild turbulence tremor passing through the fuselage. But it was nothing compared to the shaking in the silence that followed. Around them, passengers had taken notice. Some pretended to read, others reached for their phones, filming through half-zipped jackets or under magazine flaps. The feeling in the cabin had shifted, like watching a match about to meet gasoline. Darian adjusted Kelrin against his chest. The baby's small frame rested against him like a heartbeat reminder of what was truly at stake. Then, without saying a word, Darian reached down, lifted the tray back into his hand, and stood. He didn't move with aggression. His shoulders were relaxed, but the power in his stance made Renard step back half an inch without realizing it. "Sir, I can't let you approach the cockpit," Renard said sharply, tone rising now with visible cracks in confidence. "You don't have the authority to stop me," Darian answered, never looking away. "Not when it involves the injury of a passenger." "That's not how it works. There's a process," Renard argued, voice pushing harder now. "Then consider this the first correction to your process." Darian stepped forward. Renard's hand hovered near his belt, where his badge and crew ID hung. He didn't reach for Darian, but he didn't move out of the way either. It became clear then. This wasn't about policy anymore. It was about power, about who got to decide what mattered at 30,000 feet. Taran Vess looked between them, then made his choice. He turned, walked down the aisle past Renard, and tapped the intercom button near the galley. It was a simple press, but it made noise, a deliberate sound that traveled through the rows like a bell before battle. Passengers whispered again. One man in row 3 pulled out his phone and began typing rapidly. Another leaned over to a window, capturing a wide shot of the aisle and the scene unfolding within it. Darian felt their eyes. He didn't want attention. He wanted the truth. He took another step. Renard didn't block him again. The small shift was victory enough for now. From behind the cockpit door, the faint click of the latch echoed forward like a heartbeat through steel. Someone was coming. But until that door opened, Darian kept walking. His son rested quietly now. The tray was still in his hand, and the truth was almost at the door. Every step Darian took toward the cockpit was a step toward uncovering the truth that Erisline feared most. "This is what he used to hit my child." The words fell like a gavel strike in the quiet tension of the first-class cabin, and, for a moment, the entire aircraft seemed to still. Captain Laron Cade stood motionless, the tray now resting in his gloved hands, caught mid-transfer from Darian Cross. The polished surface reflected the overhead cabin lights, cold, impersonal, yet suddenly the most important object on the plane. Cade's jaw flexed as he studied it, his pilot's cap casting a sharp shadow over his eyes. His posture remained upright, almost statuesque, but there was no hiding the slight furrow in his brow, the minute twitch of his right temple. His eyes flicked toward the crib, where Kelrin's tiny fingers still gripped the edge in confusion, his whimpers softening into uneven hiccups. "I want to be clear," Darian said, his voice calm but sharpened by resolve. "This isn't a misunderstanding. That man," he tilted his head toward Renard Vale, "struck the crib. It made contact with my son's head." Renard immediately stepped forward. "Captain, I told you already it was turbulence. The tray slipped. There was no harm intended. The child's fine. You saw, didn't you?" He turned desperately toward the surrounding passengers. A few looked away. One man near the window leaned back in his seat, pulling his phone close to his chest. The woman behind Darian didn't answer. Silence was louder than denial. Captain Cade slowly raised his eyes to Taran Vess. "Is this accurate?" Taran hesitated, visibly torn. His Adam's apple bobbed, his lips pressed together for a second too long. Then, finally, he gave a single, deliberate nod. "Yes, sir. I witnessed the contact. It wasn't caused by turbulence alone." Another passenger, a man in a worn navy blazer 2 rows behind, leaned in and whispered to Darian. "My son. They did something similar. 3 months ago. I reported it. Got an email that said it was turbulence." Darian didn't blink. He simply looked at Captain Cade. "Do you have the cabin logbook?" Cade hesitated. "Not available mid-flight," he said, tone flat but not defiant. "You understand," Darian said slowly. that I have the right to document any injury caused during transit, especially to a minor." His words were calm, clean, measured, but each one felt like it carved through the aircraft's stale air with precision. Behind them, the sound of rustling uniforms filled the galley. Renard Vale stood half-hidden by the curtain, sweating, his eyes flitting between Darien and Cade like he was calculating how far this would go. Terran took a step closer to Darien, subtly aligning himself not as crew, but as ally. The shift was small, but irreversible. Passengers began murmuring louder now, some asking what had really happened, others tapping furiously on phones. One could be heard saying, "He's not shouting. He's not angry. He's not even demanding compensation. Why is this guy sweating like that?" Then, from the shadows of the galley, a man who had remained silent the entire flight finally moved. Corvin Marr stepped forward. His uniform was neat but aged, his posture calm but with the rigidness of someone who had learned long ago to watch instead of speak. He had the look of a man who had witnessed too much, stored too much, and chosen silence one time too many. He stopped beside Darien and looked at him, not with apology, but with quiet recognition. Then he leaned in just enough to speak low, his voice gravelly and steady. "You're not the first," he said. Darien met his gaze. Corvin's next words landed like cold thunder. "But you might be the last." Darien didn't react outwardly, but something shifted behind his eyes. He looked down at Kelrin, asleep again, oblivious to the battle being fought around him. And then he looked back at Corvin. "What do you know?" Darien asked, voice low. Corvin didn't answer, not yet, but his eyes moved toward the galley where Renard had disappeared once more. Then, almost imperceptibly, he nodded. The cabin had changed. It was no longer a place of quiet discomfort and corporate silence. It was becoming something else, a courtroom, a stage, a reckoning ground. Terran stepped fully beside Darien now, no longer hesitating. "He's telling the truth," he said, glancing at Corvin. "There's more going on here than anyone's willing to admit. We were told to ignore certain incidents, especially ones that might affect public perception." Captain Cade heard this and turned toward them, clearly rattled. "What kind of incidents?" Terran paused. His next words were careful. "Ones involving first-class passengers, male, traveling with infants." The phrasing was deliberate, specific, chilling. It clicked for Darien, the profiling, the hesitation, the strange silence around Kelrin's injury. This wasn't just an accident. This was a pattern. Darien looked around the cabin. Every eye was on him now, not out of fear, not out of curiosity, but because he had done something none of them had. He refused to let the silence remain comfortable. He turned back toward the cockpit and said clearly, "When we land, this won't end here." Then he turned to Corvin. "You're ready to speak?" Corvin gave a slow nod. "I've got files, reports. They never reached corporate. They were meant to disappear." Darien's voice was firm. "Then we won't let them." And in that moment, it became clear. What had started as an act of cruelty had become something else entirely. A witness had stepped out of the shadows. A man had chosen truth over protocol. And a father had shifted the entire balance of power on a flight that was no longer bound only by its destination. The silence had cracks, and one by one, truth began pouring through them. The silence had barely settled when Corvin Marr finally stepped forward. "You might want to see this," he said, voice low but steady. Darien looked up. Corvin stood in the aisle near row 1C, away from the cluster of passengers and crew now murmuring about the confrontation. Until now, Corvin had remained in the shadows, dutiful, silent, almost invisible. But something about the scene had shifted him. In his left hand, he held a slim device no larger than a card reader. He raised it slightly, enough for Darien to see the black screen and encrypted symbols flickering faintly across it. Corvin stepped closer, speaking only loud enough for Darian to hear. "I've been keeping digital logs, backups of crew-level incident reports that were never submitted to corporate." Darian didn't react immediately. His grip tightened slightly around Kaelrin, who stirred faintly in his arms. The other tray still sat beside him, untouched since the moment he'd requested it. The tension in the cabin hadn't faded, only changed form. Now it pulsed beneath every word, every glance. "What kind of reports?" Darian asked, his voice a quiet challenge. "Misconduct, suppressed complaints, passenger treatment files flagged for deletion." Corvin's voice was even, mechanical, like a man reciting a formula he'd repeated in his head 100 times but never dared speak aloud. "You're not the first, Mr. Cross, but you might be the last." Darian's jaw tightened. "Explain." Corvin nodded once, shifting his weight slightly as if measuring how much risk he was about to invite. "There's a classification system. Internal. No one outside Senior Crew Command is supposed to know. The filters tag certain passengers under vague codes: infant disruptions, non-priority visibility, PR complications. The system was built to shield crew reputations, especially when the passengers fall into what they call complex optics categories." Darian raised an eyebrow, already knowing what Corvin meant. Solo, black fathers traveling with infants. Corvin nodded grimly. "Exactly. You're automatically flagged, high risk for media trouble if something goes wrong. The crew gets instructed not to escalate, to suppress. The wording makes it sound harmless. Procedural. But it's profiling. Disguised." A wave of cold indignation washed over Darian's spine. The sting of the tray meant something entirely different now. It wasn't random. It was allowed, designed to be forgotten. "How long has this been happening?" he asked. "Years. The tags started showing up in logs right after the Tier 4 disruption protocols were updated. Some nonsense after that PR scandal 3 years ago. I noticed when the reports I submitted started vanishing, so I stopped sending them through official channels. I kept them for myself, digitally clean, time-stamped, encrypted." Darian leaned back slightly, letting the weight of the moment settle. "You realize what you're saying." "I do," Corvin said, "but after today, I'm done staying quiet." A few seats behind them, a man in business attire whispered into his phone, clearly relaying pieces of the drama. On the other side of the cabin, a passenger tapped on a laptop connected to the onboard Wi-Fi. A ripple of conversation began spreading like ink in water, quiet, persistent. Darian turned toward his tray, the one that had not been used for harm, and slowly lifted it. It felt cold in his hands, identical in design, weight, and texture to the one Rennard had used. "I need you to send those logs to me," Darian said. "Securely. Use a temp channel if you must." "I've already queued it. Check your inbox in 2 minutes. Look for Echo Ledger. It'll be locked, but you'll have the key." Darian gave a nod of acknowledgement. Then, glancing down at Kaelrin, now sleeping, unaware of the unfolding storm, he gently placed the second tray beside the first. 2 identical objects. One had been a weapon. This one, a statement. Across the aisle, Terran Vess watched. He said nothing, but the look in his eyes showed realization. The second tray wasn't there for utility. It was for symmetry. Evidence. Proof. Darian sat straighter now, eyes burning with the precision of a strategist and the focus of a father. The symbolism was powerful and deliberate. He would carry both trays off the plane. One struck his child. The other would strike the silence. Passengers were no longer just observing, they were documenting. A student recorded a whispered interview on her phone. A middle-aged man muttered to a colleague about legal representation. Darian didn't encourage or stop them. Truth was contagious now. Then came the distant chime from the cockpit, seatbelt sign on. Descent had begun. But the turbulence, Darian knew, wasn't from the sky. It was human. It was systemic. and it had a paper trail. As he pulled out his phone and opened the secured email now glowing in his inbox, he saw the first line of a hidden report. Incident. Cabin disruption. Class D. Infant agitation blamed. No crew fault logged. Recommend internal archiving. No passenger compensation. It was dated 6 months ago. The crew involved: Renard Vale. The victim? A father. Name redacted. Darian's eyes didn't flinch. He knew this plane wasn't just landing. It was arriving at a reckoning. He looked down at the two trays, one on either side of him. One carried pain. The other would carry proof. His path was clear now. What hurt his child would become the instrument of justice. The attendant smirked, confident his act would go unpunished. Unaware that every strike, every witness, and every second had already been anticipated by a CEO who doesn't tolerate harm to his family, Darian looked down at the tray, the same one that once struck his son and nearly buried the truth with it. Not a symbol, he replied. A turning point. Now, as Darian stood with Kelrin in the lounge, a young gate agent passed behind him, recognized him, and stiffened slightly, not with fear, but awareness, respect, reverence. Darian offered a nod. Nothing more. The agent returned it silently and continued on. A distant intercom announced boarding for another flight. Somewhere, a child's laugh echoed off polished glass. Darian looked down at Kelrin, who was gently tapping his fingers against the bronze plaque like he sensed something familiar. "You won't remember any of it," Darian murmured softly, brushing his son's cheek. "But I'll make sure you understand why it mattered." The journey wasn't over. Policies could change, but culture took longer. Trust, even longer. But every story needed a cornerstone, and Flight 771 had become just that. A moment where power didn't shout, but stood calmly, holding a tray and refusing to be dismissed. Back at the Valoran office, Darian's assistant, a lean, sharp-eyed man named Relin, waited by the elevator. "Boardroom's ready," he said. "You want to go over the restructure first or cradle updates?" Darian stepped inside the lift, Kelrin now resting against his shoulder. "Start with cradle." As the doors closed, Relin added, "By the way, the training video, the one from the tribunal's ethics module, it starts with your quote." Darian raised an eyebrow. "Which one?" Relin smiled faintly. "The tray line. They kept it." The elevator rose. At the top floor, Darian entered his office. The team fell quiet as he passed, not out of discomfort, but focus. He placed Kelrin in the play crib near his desk. The boy stood, wobbly but proud, reaching for a toy airplane on the shelf. As Darian turned to face the wall of flight maps and data screens, a subtle sound caught his attention. The faint metallic ping of Kelrin tapping the toy plane against the tray table Darian had repurposed into a document stand. The same tray, not hidden, not feared, just there. Sometimes justice didn't roar. Sometimes it simply sat in the open, where everyone could see it. And the tray that once struck down became the tray that lifted justice up. Seconds later, the CEO's retaliation began, using the tray to enforce accountability and freeze the entire crew in shock. Every career that crossed him ended instantly. If you believe real authority acts decisively, with precision and unstoppable momentum, subscribe now, because justice always lands first. Disclaimer: the story you just watched is fictional. It explores abuse, racism, and the consequences of mistreating others. Its purpose is to raise awareness, inspire empathy, and encourage reflection on accountability, integrity, and standing up against injustice. If you believe cruelty under a uniform always folds when strategy meets unstoppable force, hit subscribe now, because justice never hesitates. The plane jolted once, just enough to make loose plastic lids on service trays rattle, but the turbulence wasn't what made the passengers stiffen. It was the silence that followed. A kind of collective breath hold as everyone felt something else rumbling beneath the cabin floor, truth pressing upward. Captain Laurent Cade's voice finally came through the speakers, steady but somber. "Ladies and gentlemen, please remain seated as we prepare for our descent. There has been a crew-level incident under internal review. Thank you for your cooperation." The words were surgical, measured, a quiet way of saying, something went wrong. Very wrong. Renard Vale didn't move from the galley. He sat perched on the jump seat like a man handcuffed by his own smirk. The passengers didn't look at him anymore. They looked past him. Taryn Vess stood in the aisle with a pen and notebook, taking statements from anyone willing to speak. Corvin Marr, still silent but sharper now, crossed from row to row with a handheld log scanner, checking crew entries against the incident log, never saying much, but watching everything. Darian sat calmly in Seat 1C, Kelrin asleep again in his arms, his head resting just under Darian's chin. But the storm behind Darian's eyes was far from calm. His phone vibrated once beneath his blazer. The screen flashed a secure channel confirmation. Corvin's encrypted transfer had gone through. Opening the files, Darian scrolled slowly, his thumb steady despite the adrenaline curling beneath his skin. Page after page revealed misconduct reports marked as low priority, first class non-critical, or worse, discretionary documentation withheld. The language was so deliberately vague it was impossible to miss the intent. Protect the crew, discredit the passenger, keep public record clean. His eyes caught one file. Date: October 3rd, 2 years prior. Crew member, Renard Vale. Incident. Summary: physical contact with a toddler during tray delivery. Status: internal warning only. No further action taken. Darian's lips parted slightly. His gaze hardened. 2 years, and still flying. Still unchecked. Still dangerous. He inhaled once through his nose and looked down at Kelrin. The boy's face was peaceful again, unaware that he had just become the center of a reckoning. Darian leaned back slightly, cradling his son tighter, as if reminding himself that protection didn't end with comfort. It extended into policy, into accountability, into war, if necessary. He turned his attention back to the files. One report referenced the phrase infant class disruptions, a term so clinical it nearly made him laugh. But the disgust was real. These weren't random incidents. They were part of a systemic method to suppress reports involving children, especially when the parent didn't match the unspoken image of ideal clientele. Solo black fathers with infants, labeled as PR liabilities. Quietly, strategically. Rage swelled, but Darian kept his tone measured. He tapped his legal assistant's encrypted contact on the secure app. Attached 2 key documents. Drafted a short directive. Subject: Executive Termination, Aris Line 2, Valoran Systems Board, Secure Recipients Only. Message: Effective immediately. We are to begin the withdrawal of all executive travel partnerships with Aris Line. This directive is non-negotiable. Details forthcoming. Darian Cross. As the message sent, he felt the plane dip slightly, nose angled downward toward Halvran Terminal. Descent had begun. Outside the cabin windows, city lights began flickering into view through cloud breaks. But inside, the pressure was shifting. No longer just atmospheric, but reputational, cultural, legal. Renard had yet to say a word since the captain's vague announcement, but Darian noticed the man's fingers twitching, like someone waiting for a plan to activate. Or crumble. A few rows back, a young man in a gray blazer leaned over his tray and asked quietly, "Are you going to sue them?" Darian didn't respond right away. He looked at the tray resting across his own lap, the same tray that had struck his child. Now, calm, quiet, harmless, but only because he held it. "I'm going to do something better," Darian finally said. The man blinked. "What's better than a lawsuit?" Darien turned slightly, eyes steady. "I'm going to make sure this never happens to anyone again." Corvin approached just then. His voice was low, barely above a breath. "There's more," he said. "The files go back 6 years. They've kept this hidden a long time. But your case, it might be the one they can't bury." Darien didn't nod. He didn't smile. He just looked down at his son again, then lifted his eyes to the front of the plane, toward the cockpit, toward whatever was waiting beyond the runway, and he reached for the tray again, not to return it, but to keep it, to carry it forward. Just before the wheels touched asphalt, the final sentence of his internal memo echoed in his thoughts. "This tray isn't just a symbol," Darien whispered under his breath. "It's a switch." And with resolve hardening in his chest as the aircraft slowed on the runway and the world outside began to take notice, he thought one final thing. And Darien was about to flip it. The wheels touched down with a hiss, smooth as silk, but Darien Cross's mind was anything but calm. As the aircraft rolled toward Gate 6 at Halvern Terminal, he rose to his feet before the chime even rang. The seatbelt sign was still glowing red. With one arm he held his sleeping son tightly against his chest, Kelrin's head resting gently under his chin. In his other hand, he gripped the cold metal tray like it was a weapon forged not of steel, but of truth. "I'd like law enforcement at the gate," he said aloud, firm, measured, unshaken. Passengers looked up in stunned silence. Some blinked, others froze mid-motion as they reached for overhead bins. A few instinctively turned on their phone cameras again. Renard Vale, still sulking in the rear galley, looked up as if he'd misheard. But the request was already being relayed. One of the compliance buttons near the flight deck had been discreetly pressed by Captain Cade, who had remained in the cockpit since the confrontation. The moment Darien made his request, a chain reaction began beyond the cabin walls. Darien didn't raise his voice. He didn't pace. He didn't point. He simply adjusted Kelrin's carrier harness on his chest, then looked down at the tray in his hand with a gaze sharpened by resolve. His mind ran through timelines and pre-drafted contingencies. Every moment since the strike had been building to this. Taryn Vess approached from the galley, pale but composed. "They're sending airport compliance officers," he whispered, and "I think media was alerted. Someone tipped them off." "Good," Darien replied, not looking away from the front of the aircraft. "Let them meet me at the gate." The aircraft came to a final halt. The cabin lights brightened. Tension, however, did not ease. It calcified. A uniformed officer appeared at the jetway's window. Another behind him. Then 2 men in Navy compliance vests entered slowly, their badges clipped to their belts. The front door hissed open. Darien was the first to step off, the tray still in hand. His posture was unwavering. Each step echoed. Behind him, the cabin remained frozen, passengers unsure whether to applaud or retreat. Kelrin stirred slightly against his chest but didn't cry. It was as if even the infant sensed his father's calm. On the tarmac, beyond the corridor glass, cameras had already started blinking. Darien didn't look for them. He walked toward the terminal doors with deliberate focus. Just past security, a white podium had been wheeled out, standard protocol for VIP press moments at Halvern Terminal. The airport had no idea how symbolic that podium would become. At least 6 reporters had gathered within minutes. 1 camera crew rolled live. A security cordon formed a half circle, and Darien walked straight through the chaos, not dodging questions, not flinching, until he stood behind the podium, tray in hand. Captain Cade had not exited yet. Neither had Renard, but that no longer mattered. Darien placed the tray on the white podium slowly, the metal clinking softly against the smooth surface. His fingertips lingered on it for a beat longer. Then he looked up at the sea of cameras, his voice calm and steady. "This," he said, his hand resting flat on the tray, "was the first thing that hit my child." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Every lens leaned in. He paused. Then, with the weight of quiet thunder behind his words, he finished. It's also the last thing Arisline will ever ignore. The line landed with the force of a gavel strike. The flashbulbs burst. The microphone surged forward. But Darian didn't stay for questions. He nodded once, stepped back, and walked away as security and media scrambled to process what had just happened. Unseen by the press was the flash drive in his inside jacket pocket. A tiny piece of plastic, but one that held Corvin Marr's encrypted archive, dozens of suppressed reports, incident logs, and internal memos pointing to a pattern the airline had tried to bury. Darian's legal team had already received copies via secure Wi-Fi mid-flight. The class action filing had been submitted 30 minutes before touchdown. The wheels had barely stopped rolling before Arisline's legal department was blindsided by an official petition citing violations of federal aviation safety protocols, discrimination statutes, and failure to report crew misconduct. Back at Gate 6, Renard Vale was escorted off the aircraft with no ceremony. The bitterness in his eyes said he still didn't believe this would stick, that somehow, as it had always gone before, the company would protect him. He didn't know the rules had changed. Even Captain Cade looked unsettled as he deboarded. He paused by the glass, watching the crowd gather around the tray, the cameras angled upward, the whispers starting to echo. He turned, as if realizing that whatever came next, this wasn't going away quietly. Darian, walking past the terminal's main atrium, received a message on his phone. The subject line, "Petition filed, docket number 771A. Beneath it, a simple confirmation, "Federal complaint received." Next step, public disclosure window. He didn't smile. He didn't need to. He had made his move. Quiet, precise, inevitable. And the tray, it stayed on that podium under bright lights, the flashbulbs still popping. The press conference wasn't a reaction. It was the beginning of a reckoning. The flash of cameras greeted Darian Cross the moment he stepped off Arisline Flight 771, cradling his son, Kelrin, against his chest with one arm and carrying the metal tray in the other like a courtroom exhibit. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. The battered tray, scratched, bent slightly at the corner where it had struck his child's crib, spoke louder than any press release. News crews had already gathered by the time the aircraft door opened. Passengers had live-tweeted the confrontation. Videos of the incident had spread online before the plane even touched the ground. By noon, the hashtags were everywhere. Hashtag Tray of Truth, hashtag Flight 771 Justice, hashtag Darian Cross. But Darian hadn't come for slogans. He had come for systemic change. Inside the press conference room at Halvern Terminal, he stepped calmly to the podium. The tray, still warm from being held tight during the flight, clinked as he placed it gently on the wooden surface. He adjusted Kelrin's carrier strap and then faced the crowd. His voice, when it came, was even, calm, and deliberate. "This," he said, resting his palm lightly on the tray, "was the first thing that hit my child. It's also the last thing Arisline will ever ignore." Gasps didn't echo, but the silence was heavy, charged. Reporters sat frozen, their fingers pausing over keyboards. No anger, no dramatic gestures, just calm clarity, and the damning symbol of a company's neglect. Darian left the room without taking questions. He had no intention of performing. He had already said what needed to be said. Behind the scenes, Arisline was falling into chaos. Their legal division scrambled to understand how the flash drive, containing hidden misconduct records from internal staff, had slipped past their filters. Compliance officers began combing through logs. Phone calls between senior executives grew panicked, whispering about damage control, reputation management, and containment. But there was no containing what had already started. Within hours, Arisline's official account posted a brief apology on social media. "We regret the incident and are conducting a full internal investigation." It was bland, sanitized, strategically vague. Darian responded not with more press, but with strategy. He issued a written public statement through Valoran Systems' media team. No theatrics, no outrage, just facts. The letter began with a single sentence. This isn't about a tray, it's about a system that chose silence over safety. He detailed everything. Corvin Mars' encrypted records, the profiling of solo black fathers with infants, the suppression of incident reports, and the incentive system that rewarded crews for incident-free quarters, regardless of how those incident-free metrics were achieved. His tone never accused, it exposed. Taryn Vess, now a named whistleblower, confirmed everything in a sworn affidavit. So did Captain Liren Cade, who revealed he had long suspected post-incident filters were being applied by crew supervisors before data ever reached official logs. Both men were subpoenaed not as targets, but as witnesses to a larger scheme. At Arisline's headquarters, CEO Grant Halver convened an emergency board meeting. But even inside those walls, loyalty was cracking. Legal memos resurfaced, some signed by Halver himself, advising that complaints involving infant disruptions should be handled delicately to avoid demographic bias litigation. What had once been coded language now read like confession. Meanwhile, Valoran Systems acted swiftly. Darian, still in his pressed travel suit, convened a digital board vote from his phone before the day ended. The resolution passed unanimously. All partnership contracts with Arisline were terminated immediately. No flights, no loyalty programs, no elite booking tiers. The move cut Arisline's annual corporate revenue by over $48 million in executive travel and logistics support. A reporter tried to catch Darian for a quote that evening as he exited the terminal. The man asked if Darian had any personal message for Arisline's executives. Darian paused for just a moment before answering. The man, who carried a tray off the plane, now carried the company's future in his palm. The first complaint hit the Cradle Protocol inbox at 6:03 a.m., barely an hour after Darian Cross held the press conference with the tray placed solemnly on the podium. By noon, there were over 300. By the end of the day, that number surpassed 900. They came in waves, emails, voicemails, typed-out personal statements. Some were shaky phone recordings of weeping fathers, others written in clipped factual language by men clearly used to being ignored. Each story followed the same brutal rhythm. A moment of mistreatment, a plea for justice, and then the quiet disappearance of the incident beneath corporate silence. Darian sat in the central briefing room of Valoran Systems headquarters, which had temporarily been converted into the operational base for the Cradle Protocol. He didn't wear a suit. He wore a black crewneck and jeans, Kelrin asleep beside him in a covered bassinet. On the screen before him, a young man with glassy eyes was recounting how his 2-year-old son had been struck by a crew member with a beverage cart, then written up as passenger turbulence interference. The audio cracked, but the pain didn't need clarity to cut. Darian leaned forward slowly, his fingertips pressed against his lips. His expression didn't change, but the fire behind his eyes deepened. "Get me the name of that airline," he said, turning to Lionel Crest, a pro bono lawyer who had volunteered that morning, "and the employee roster." That case became the first legal action Cradle Protocol filed, and the first victory. The flight attendant in question was fired within 48 hours, the airline offering a quiet settlement before the media caught scent. But for Darian, it was proof. Flight 771 wasn't a one-off. It was the tip of a system designed to survive by erasing the people it hurt. A week later, the emergency hearing convened. The National Aviation Ethics Tribunal was gathered in a wood-paneled room in Halvern City, with 3 magistrates at the head of a long semicircle dais. Each wore the same stiff formality that came with bureaucratic power, careful language, neutral expressions, and eyes trained to spot both lies and loopholes. Darian wasn't in the room. He testified remotely, his face clean-shaven, steady, and lit by the soft afternoon glow coming through his office window. Kelrin sat in his lap, squirming slightly, chewing on a teething ring while his father described how Arisline had knowingly excluded infant injury incidents from 5 consecutive public safety reports. "Let me be clear," Darian said, voice calm but heavy. "These weren't clerical oversights. These were deliberate omissions hidden behind compliance codes, masked in legal euphemisms like non-reportable disturbances and passenger class variance events. They're engineered blind spots." He paused, holding up a printed screenshot of a memo from Arisline's internal database, retrieved from the flash drive Corvin Marr had risked his job to hand over. The memo had one bold header: Passenger Risk Metrics, Infants. Below it, a list of flagged keywords like Solo Guardian, Non-Priority Loyalty, and Public Image Concern. One column caught the tribunal's attention: Silence Potential, High, Moderate, Low. "Families like mine," Darian continued, "were seen as high risk not because of our behavior, but because our silence couldn't be guaranteed." Gasps were audible, even over the virtual feed. One magistrate, a silver-haired man named Weller Grayson, leaned in and muttered something to his assistant. The panel requested a recess to study the evidence in detail. Back in the office, Darian muted his microphone and gently shifted Kelrin to his shoulder. The infant sighed, half asleep. "They didn't think we'd speak up," he said quietly, more to himself than anyone else. When the hearing resumed, the tribunal summoned a data ethics expert to validate the flash drive's contents. The files were real, undeniably so. They documented 5 quarters of selective filtering, all tied to performance bonuses based on incident-free quarters. The phrase echoed like a verdict. Arisline's defense attempted to frame the omissions as over-reliance on legal filters, but it collapsed under the weight of internal documents, emails from HR managers, memos approved by CEO Grant Halver himself, and spreadsheets listing which crew members received bonuses after high-risk events went unreported. Darian sat quietly through it all, no trace of triumph on his face. He didn't need the room to praise him. He needed the system to change. Lionel, seated beside him in the office, whispered, "You've just opened the floodgates." But Darian didn't answer. He adjusted Kelrin's blanket and stared at the screen, where the tribunal's clerk was reading through the final memo aloud. A policy revision dated 6 months prior, authorizing supervisors to pre-screen any incident involving first-class passengers traveling with infants for legal escalation risk before forwarding to HQ. It wasn't just unethical. It was premeditated. Outside the Valoran building, reporters clustered around the sidewalk, waiting for a reaction. Darian didn't step outside. Instead, he released a written statement that evening. "These aren't isolated mistakes. They are a culture. And cultures don't change because we expose them. They change because we replace them." By the time the sun rose over Halvrin the next morning, tribunals across 3 states had called for independent audits of their top carriers. The spark had become a signal fire, and as Darian leaned back, Kelrin, now asleep on his chest, he looked not at the television screen reporting the news, but at the tray mounted on his wall. A simple metal tray, burnished now with fingerprints and purpose. The man whose child was struck now struck the silence from every safety report. The first termination order arrived less than 24 hours after Darian's press conference. It was crisp, official, and final. Renard Vale had been permanently banned from all commercial airlines operating within the National Aviation Network. But the decision didn't come quietly. As he was escorted from Arisline headquarters by internal security, a swarm of reporters pressed against the glass lobby, shouting questions he refused to answer. His jaw was clenched, face pale, the defiance that once animated his every move now hollow. He didn't speak, but his silence carried the weight of disbelief. He hadn't expected to be held accountable. Back in the capital, federal prosecutors moved quickly. The formal indictment charged Renard with 2 counts, assaulting a minor aboard a commercial aircraft and falsifying a federal incident report. The Aviation Passenger Protection Act, long considered a paper statute with minimal enforcement, was being tested in full force for the first time in over a decade. Darian's legal team had included precise timestamps, passenger testimonies, and the unaltered footage from Flight 771, all of it cross-verified with the encrypted crew logs Corvin Marr had secretly preserved. There was no room for doubt. Meanwhile, Corvin Marr stood quietly in the lobby of the Department of Transportation, flanked by federal officers. The man who had once kept his head low and his voice lower was now a central figure in a national reform effort. Inside a private room, a representative from the Office of Whistleblower Protection handed him a sealed folder and said, "You're safe now, and you're not alone anymore." Corvin didn't smile, but he gave a quiet nod of acknowledgement. In that moment, the years of silence that had haunted him began to loosen their grip. At the same time, Darian received a secure message from Cradle Protocol's temporary headquarters. Taryn Vess had accepted the offer to serve as Director of Compliance Reform. The decision was unanimous among the advisory board. Taryn had not only risked his position to tell the truth, but had shown the resolve to reform the system that nearly silenced him. When Darian called him, Taryn answered immediately. "I thought they'd blackball me," Taryn said, voice cracking slightly. "They tried," Darian replied, his voice steady. "Now you get to rewrite the rules." As the firings rippled outward, Aerisline headquarters found itself besieged, not by protesters, but by truth. Employees resigned. Mid-level supervisors, once protected by layers of bureaucracy, were suddenly unshielded. Internal memos leaked. The biggest rupture came when a confidential message surfaced from CEO Grant Halver himself, an email dated nearly 18 months prior, bearing his digital signature. It approved the profiling directive. The message read, "Maintain discretion when classifying infant disruption risk categories. Avoid public documentation unless legally required. Prioritize crew stability over PR fallout." It was all the proof Darian needed. News outlets flooded the airwaves. "Profiling memo confirms discriminatory policy," one headline screamed. "CEO Halver approved risk tags for infant passengers," read another. By the end of the week, Grant Halver stood at the same press podium Darian had occupied days earlier. His resignation speech was brief, dry, and unapologetic. He mentioned leadership transitions, organizational healing, and refocusing core values. But he never mentioned the tray. He didn't need to. In the vacuum left by his departure, Aerisline's board convened an emergency session. Under mounting legal pressure and public scrutiny, they dissolved the existing Human Resources Division entirely. A new compliance structure was installed, one designed by Darian and his advisory team from Cradle Protocol. The reforms weren't suggestions, they were mandates. Every long-haul flight would now be assigned a third-party safety liaison. Each aircraft's logbook would be independently verified before landing. New hire training included a module on unconscious bias and ethical decision-making. But most significantly, a zero-excuse policy was established. Any act of violence or endangerment by a crew member would result in immediate suspension pending investigation, regardless of seniority, tenure, or prior performance. Inside his office at Valoran Systems, Darian read the reform documents with measured calm. The final clause bore his imprint, the same one he had written in the cabin of Flight 771 while holding Kelrin close. When a reporter called that afternoon and asked, "Do you feel victorious?" Darian didn't pause. "I'm not here for revenge," he said. "I'm here so no child has to be quiet while the adults lie." His voice carried across the airwaves. By evening, airports across the country had posted new gatewall pledges bearing those very words in bold lettering. Some terminals even etched them into metal plaques. Travelers paused to read them. Flight attendants noticed. Supervisors took photos. A shift had begun, not in policy alone, but in culture. And, for the first time, the tray that once silenced an infant now spoke on every gate wall in the country. The bronze plaque gleamed beneath the lounge lights like a wound that had finally scarred over. Darian stood before it in silence. Kelrin balanced on his hip, nearly walking now, one tiny hand resting against his father's chest. A replica of the tray, mounted in clear glass beside the plaque, seemed oddly quiet in its casing, too light for the weight it now carried in history. 6 months had passed, but the memory of Flight 771 was carved deeper than any rebrand or press release could reach. Passengers arriving at Halvern Terminal's first-class lounge paused now, not to admire architecture or sip espresso, but to read the words beneath Darian's bronze likeness. This is the last time silence was used as a seatbelt. Some stared, others whispered. A few took photos, while others just stood in thoughtful stillness. No one laughed. Darian didn't speak much about that flight anymore, not to the media, not even to his board. But each time he passed that lounge on his way to another quiet departure, something in his chest stirred, not pain, but something older, firmer, legacy. The world had shifted in the shadow of a tray. Across the country, airlines scrambled to rewrite safety manuals, update conduct policies, and install third-party misconduct monitors. At legal conferences, the tray incident had its own slide deck. Civil aviation instructors used the footage, submitted by passengers and released legally by Darian's team, as a case study in silence, power, and response under pressure. Inside Valoran Systems, life moved forward with subtle adjustments. Darian resumed his CEO role without ceremony. No headlines, no handshakes, just work. But the staff noticed one change, the second nameplate now fastened below his office door. It was blackened steel with silver lettering that read, Founder, The Cradle. Protocol. Visitors paused when they read it. Some asked, most understood. That office was no longer just where strategies were drawn. It was where silence had been broken permanently. Not long after the tribunal reforms passed, Darian received a quiet invitation from Halvern Terminal's Reformation Committee. They were creating a commemorative wall for pivotal changes in aviation safety. They wanted his input. He didn't ask for a statue. He asked for the tray to be mounted, not shined, not polished, just displayed as it was, slightly bent, dented on one edge. "What will you call it?" the committee chair had asked. That single sentence cracked the illusion of control Renard had tried to maintain. His jaw clenched and he stepped back into the galley shadows. Captain Cade exhaled slowly, the sound subtle but noticeable in the quiet cabin. Darian adjusted Kelrin against his chest, wrapping one arm more securely around him. His other hand stayed near his waist, fingers still tingling from gripping the tray a few minutes earlier. "You know this needs to be logged," he said, not as a suggestion, but as a directive. "Properly, with witness testimony and cabin records." Cade didn't respond right away. He glanced down at the tray in his hands again, and then, subtly, he stiffened. Not at the object, at something remembered. "There was a memo," he said finally, voice low but audible, "from Arisline Legal, about 2 months ago. It instructed all captains to filter incidents involving infants through legal before making a formal report." Darian frowned. "Filter through legal? What does that even mean?" Cade didn't answer. Taryn looked confused. I don't remember hearing anything like that." "You wouldn't have," Cade said quietly. "It was sent only to certain personnel, command tier, senior operations. It mentioned avoiding PR escalation and specifically referenced infant class disruptions. That's the phrase they used." "In what world," Darian asked slowly, voice deepening with disbelief, "does an infant, especially one harmed by a crew member, count as a disruption?" Cade didn't look at him. His silence spoke volumes. Darian's thoughts turned sharp, methodical. The phrasing wasn't random. It wasn't just a careless term. It sounded like policy, a sterile phrase crafted by lawyers, not flight crew, a shield designed not to protect passengers, but the company. And whoever created that policy had clearly never held a crying child bruised by metal mid-flight. His mind shifted into CEO mode, analysis, logic, risk. If this policy was real, then what happened to Kelrin wasn't isolated. It was part of a systemic failure, a loophole so clinical it could sanitize violence with terminology, and Captain Cade, whether he liked it or not, was trapped in the middle. "Captain," Darian said after a long pause, "I'm asking you directly. Are you under pressure not to log this?" Cade's head lifted slightly. His gaze met Darian's and held it. Then he nodded. One sharp, decisive motion. No excuses, no sidestepping. The tension in the cabin changed instantly. What had been a singular conflict between a passenger and a crew member was now something more. Passengers exchanged glances. Phones rose again, silently recording. In row 3, a businessman closed his laptop and leaned forward, listening intently. Taryn looked shaken. "This can't be how things are handled," he muttered. "It's not right." Cade stepped back slightly, adjusting the tray in his hand as though it had become a burden. "I didn't want to believe it was about silence," he said quietly. "But the moment I saw the memo, I knew we'd crossed a line." "Not just a line," Darian replied, holding Kelrin closer. "A wall built to keep people like me quiet." The captain didn't argue. He simply stepped aside, the tray still in hand. Darian didn't move yet. He looked around, feeling the shift in atmosphere. What was once apathy now carried weight. Passengers were paying attention, not out of curiosity anymore, but concern. The silence between men was louder than anything the engines could produce. Then Captain Cade turned to the cabin crew intercom, his voice level but cold. "Cabin announcement in 60 seconds. I'll log the first report manually. We'll follow standard escalation protocol upon landing." Darian didn't smile. He simply nodded. It wasn't a victory. Not yet. But it was a crack in the armor. He didn't need applause. He needed truth to begin its climb. Darian wasn't just dealing with a violent tray. He was facing a violent policy. Renard Vale's voice was sharp as he snapped, "There's nothing more to report." But Darian Cross didn't flinch. He stood still near his first-class seat, Kelrin tucked gently against his chest, the infant's soft breathing a contrast to the rising tension in the air. Without raising his voice, Darian looked directly at Captain Cade and said, "I want an incident report filed now, signed by you and by him." He motioned to Taryn Vess, who had been lingering on the edge of the confrontation, nervously watching the storm build. Taryn blinked as if shocked to be included, then nodded, his voice steadier than before. "Yes, I saw it happen. I'll sign it." The silence that followed rippled through the cabin like an invisible wave. Passengers leaned forward. Some lowered their phone screens. One older man in a gray business jacket cleared his throat and said, "I recorded it, by the way, just in case you need a copy."